I would like to welcome everyone back to uh, this event. We have all freshly rebooted. Things are going to be fine. Um, so here we go. This is not the original interview. This is now the gritty reboot of the original interview. So we'll just scowl at the camera now and then and talk like we're Batman. Um, I'd like to welcome everyone watching this to this conversation. With me today is Dr. Carol Lee, who's principal scientist here at our Developer Success Lab. And we're going to be talking today about some recent, not just research, but very practical research that she has published in the last couple of days about code review anxiety, which is an interesting topic and one that's dear to my heart, having had that experience myself more than once. Carol, can I don't want to take this away from you. Can you tell us a little bit about what this research is?
Yeah, so this research at its core, the technical version of this is that it's looking at what code review anxiety looks like, what causes code review anxiety in the moment. Code review anxiety being defined as any stress or anxiety you experience during code reviews. I want to mention that this means when you're giving a code review and receiving a code review, right? So like both receiving and giving feedback can be tough. And then it also tests the effectiveness using a randomized controlled trial of a code review anxiety intervention. And then this workbook really puts that research into practice so that you can use that, intervention on your own. I think kind of the real story behind this, though, is that anxiety can be incredibly lonely. We all feel it. It's something that it's a deeply human experience that we don't talk about, right? And because we don't talk about it, it feels like we're so alone in this. And honestly, at the core of this project, what I really wanted to do was kind of let people know, like, hey, you're actually not alone in this. Everybody experiences anxiety. Code review anxiety itself is actually super common. And just because it's there doesn't mean that you can't do anything about it, right? There's this way that we treat anxiety sometimes where we're like, oh, everybody has it, so whatever. And that's not really a good reason to ignore it. I think that's an even better reason to do something about it, right? And so that's kind of at the core of this project.
One of the things you mentioned was it's not just giving and receiving, but the other thing that came across in this report was that it's not unique to any particular group of developers, junior developers, senior developers. Um, would you care to talk about that for a bit?
Yeah, I think there's this way that we talk about code review anxiety in the current industry kind of commentary, which is that it's a junior developer thing, right? Folks are like, oh, you'll just kind of grow out of it. Don't worry about it. Everybody experiences code review anxiety when they first start. But actually, what we're seeing is that code review anxiety happens to folks across experience levels. And I think that's so important because when we continuously push this narrative that code review anxiety is a junior developer thing, what can actually happen is that when you're an experienced developer, maybe you have 10 years of coding experience and you're like, I still feel code review anxiety. And you're telling me that it's a junior developer thing. And now I feel kind of ashamed of my anxiety. And now I'm going to spiral and I feel even worse. And this is just kind of a recipe for disaster. So we actually have to stop this narrative because what we're seeing is that, hey, everybody experiences code review anxiety, whether you have a year of experience, 65 years of experience, which is kind of something we saw in our research actually. It's common.
65 years of experience.
Yeah, yeah,
Jeez. Uh, there's probably a life lesson in there somewhere, right? Like expecting to grow out of things that you aren't actively trying to change or that you don't
yeah.
really know how to change can take far, far longer than anyone thinks they should, right? And in the meantime, you've just got to endure this experience, expecting that you're going to grow out of it, whatever that means.
Yeah,
Um,
I think going back to this piece where like we don't talk about anxiety, right? So some of these folks who had many, these 40 plus years of experience said things like, I didn't know that this was a thing that I could do something about. Or like, I didn't know that this was something worth, mentioning. I've just been kind of sitting with this thing all these years. And then I saw this study flyer and was like, I have that actually. I guess I can do something about it, which was really cool to see.
this has some parallels in your trace model for healthy metrics that you've used as well. right? The ideas of transparency and agency are so critical to mental health when we're not just talking about metrics, but when we're talking about, how we can have agency over our individual interactions, over the sort of the mental state we have as developers.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you'll even see in the code review anxiety workbook, the first skill you learn is actually to assess your own anxiety. I say this all the time. You literally can't do something about something if you don't even know it's happening, right? You have to know something is happening in order to do something about it. So yeah.
There's any number of lines about this in, philosophy, the whole "this is water" thing, right? Uh, but it's very true. Like what we think and our ability to perceive how we think and how we feel is often so marginal, right? It's just everything in our experience feels just real and immediate and like it is a naturally occurring phenomenon, right? And not necessarily something that we can have, visibility into and agency over, and to some extent, control over, right? To be able to change our experience of how we feel here. I would like that seems like a deeper question, and it also seems like one that you've thought about a lot over a long road to get here. Like what brought you here? Like you started out as an undergraduate, you got yourself in through a PhD program, you are here principal scientist doing research into, the internal functioning of developers in the world and how to improve that. How did you get here?
That's such a good question. I love that. Um, I got my doctorate in clinical psychology, obviously. And my expertise in grad school was one, anxiety and stress, and then two, also understanding how to make interventions better. And I care deeply about these things because, I mean, partly for the reason I said earlier, where anxiety is just one of those things that people don't think about. It's almost too common. I always think about when I first, submitted my first grant. One of the grant proposal reviewers at NIH took me aside at a conference, and I won't say his name, but he was like, one of the problems with anxiety is that it's just so unsexy. I was like, true. This is very true. He was like, so it's
Yep.
going to be hard to find grant funding for this. I'm sorry. And I was like, okay, yeah. And I think that's a really interesting thing where anxiety is so relatable that it feels like it's not a big deal. And yet it is a really integral part of how we make decisions. It's a really integral part of how we behave in the world, right? And so anxiety has always been really interesting to me personally. I've also been really interested in understanding how to make interventions better. And as a part of that, like helping people feel seen. I really care deeply about helping people feel like their experiences are seen, that they're valid, and that they're real, and that they are okay, right? I care a lot about making people feel like they're not crazy. Um, and so something that really drew me to doing science with developers is that when I started working on some mental health tech related stuff, it became really interesting to see that folks weren't really thinking about their developers, right? So people are talking about mental health of the customer or consumers, et cetera, et cetera. And they weren't really applying it to their developer teams. And I thought that was just such an interesting thing because your developers are also people with mental health. And so that got me really interested in, okay, well, what is developers' mental health like? What is their well-being like? And it's like, spoiler alert, it's not that great. Y'all don't exist
Yeah.
on teams that, celebrate this very much. People
Hmm.
aren't like, all right, like let's talk about well-being and mental health. Like that isn't a core value of most software teams. And I think that's just really important because at the heart of it, at the heart of all the stuff that we use on the day-to-day basis, things like hospital systems, for example, things like suicide flags in hospital systems, right? Things like our banking, things like our education, all of this actually runs on software. And so you want to make sure that the people writing that stuff is in a good place. And we've actually just kind of been like ignoring them. And so that really led to me being here, where I really care about kind of helping developers feel seen.
There's an old and I think apocryphal story about somebody asking a bank robber, like, why do you rob banks? And their answer was, well, because that's where all the money is. And so I suppose if you're researching anxiety, coming into software development, where, as you say, like the stakes are so high, for so
Yeah.
many of these systems that we build, not just in our social interactions around them, but in the consequences of our actions. Like there are developers out there who write the software that controls anti-lock brakes. And there are developers out there writing the software that controls the landing gear in aircraft. And this list, in a world where almost all of our interactions are to some extent mediated by software, the stakes and the consequences of that can be enormously stressful, right?
Yeah.
As particularly as you come to greater terms with them. And so that is, I have a long-standing rant that, like, what is software? Like, software is an idea that we've turned into a machine. It comes out of the inside of your head, right? And so it might be worthwhile if the inside of your head was a pleasant place to live.
Yeah. This is
Right?
very true. Yeah.
So one of the things that I think made this report fascinating was the intervention stage, the utility of the intervention, and not just the fact of being able to do that. And I would like, I'm hoping you can sort of walk us through what an intervention looks like in this model, but also really how stark the results were, like how striking the effectiveness of these results were. Can you tell us a little bit about what organizing or running an intervention like this looks like to somebody who's, an aspiring mediator in this context?
Running this intervention is a joy. I will just say that. Running this intervention as a randomized controlled trial is a lot of work. Let me just put that out there. um, it requires a lot of running workshops at weird time zones because you're trying to make sure that it's accessible across time zones and all these different things. It's exhausting, I'm gonna say. My participants got to see me like very late at night and very early morning, and it's a lot of work. It is also intensely rewarding. This intervention in particular is based on cognitive behavioral principles. So cognitive behavioral principles have some major kind of core assets or kind of tenets to it. The first one is to build awareness, right? Is to find a way to understand and monitor what is happening within yourself. It's really hard to keep track of, what symptoms are happening for you if you don't know what those symptoms are, like I said earlier, right? And so that's actually a really core piece of this kind of intervention. So our assessment piece is directly taken from a cognitive behavioral intervention. It's called the Subjective Units of Distress Scale, SUDS. It's a very well-known and widely used measure. It's a 0 to 10 scale, and it's in the workbook itself. And so you'll be, if you go through the workbook, you'll be cued to like report your SUDS throughout, right? You kind of take an experimental lens as a participant or, somebody going through this intervention where you try a thing that the intervention tells you to do. And it's like, now what's your SUDS? Did it change? Did it not change? Maybe this one's not for you. Try something else. Like, now did your SUDS change? Right? So it's kind of cool there where it gives you a lot of agency where you're like, that one didn't quite land with me, but this one really did. And now I know that about myself and about myself's reaction to this intervention, right? The other core pieces of it are kind of managing your physiological responses. A lot of times we tend to think that there's like one magic bullet for any sort of mental health intervention. People are like, just do deep breathing and you'll be great for life. This is not true, okay? This is truly not true. Deep breathing doesn't work for everybody, and that's okay. Like, it doesn't have to work for everybody, for example. But one thing that we do
Have you
know,
checked the box that says have a mental health?
have a mental health, yeah. Oh my gosh. But yeah, I mean, one thing we know about like when we have really strong physiological responses is that it's really hard to think and it's really hard to do, right? So if you're in the middle of hyperventilating, it's like, and someone's like, well, have you thought about like thinking this way? You're like, no, I'm literally focused on hyperventilating right now. So actually, no, I'm not doing any of that. So we kind of go over how to reduce some of that arousal in the moment. And then we also go over how to balance challenge or bias thoughts. So oftentimes anxiety functions by making us think really terrible things about ourselves and the world around us. We call these negatively biased thoughts. Negatively biased because they're typically very biased and they're not typically positive, right? So when I'm feeling anxious, I'm not like, damn girl, you're awesome, right? I'm like, damn girl, you suck.
This is
Yeah, I'm like,
the This is the best panic attack you've had.
Yeah, like you're
Good
so good
work.
at that, you're killing it.
You're
Like, no,
amazing, killing it.
not happening. Yeah,
Yeah, that's
yeah.
right. This is a reasonable thing to think you should have, and a totally good thing to want. I'm winning at panic attacks. Amazing,
Exactly.
right? Gold
But
stars for all
yeah,
of
I
us.
mean, like our participants, and oftentimes some of these thoughts, like once you say them out loud, you're like, that was really strange. Like, I can't believe I've been telling myself that. So one of our participants, for example, had a negative automatic thought or a negatively biased thought of like, this is how I die. And I was like, this is not how you die. This code review is not how you die, right? And like once they said it, they were like, obviously this is not how I die, but that's just what's been going on in my head, right? Or like
Ooh,
someone had a thought like what's another one that was really interesting? Oh, they were like my feedback is going to be so bad that it's going to make the person whose code I'm reviewing leave the company. Like this person is going to quit because they hated my code review so much, right? So people have these thoughts that maybe they don't fully believe, but that they tell themselves, and that actually makes your anxiety worse and obviously makes you not want to engage with the code review. So learning how to kind of notice those thoughts and then think of a more self-compassionate way to think about it. And then finally, teaching folks how to actually proactively engage with code reviews rather than avoiding them. So yeah.
I'd like to hear more about that third step, but I think that how do you keep like what would you suggest to somebody who is on this journey of trying to like grapple with their own inner monologue, which is hard, right?
Mhm.
Like I've had that experience myself of like, come on, brain, shut up, we've got work to do here. How do you coach people through, I guess, what starts off as a very difficult negotiation?
Mhm. I think a really important piece is actually taking it out of your head and writing it down, right? Oftentimes we kind of engage in this monologue, and because there's nobody else to talk about it with except ourselves, it just becomes like a running little tape in our heads, right? And actually taking the time to write that work down, write the stuff you're saying down, can help you kind of move away from it. We actually call this process in psychology called decentering, which so you can kind of think about this as like when we're so close to our thoughts, when that's all we're thinking about, right? You are fused to your thoughts. If you think about it as like there's like a piece of paper and you put it right into front of your face, literally all you can see is the piece of paper, right? So that's you being fused. You can't see past it. When you write your thoughts down and get some space between your mind and these thoughts, it's like moving the piece of paper like away from your face. Now you can see the piece of paper, but you can also see that there's an entire world around it, right? So you're getting space away from it. So that's one really big first step is actually just writing these thoughts down so that you can look at them.
I've seen people say that at in other sports, particularly around
Mm.
people who've got to keep track of their own performance in other fields. But I've never seen it done for programmers. I've never seen something like this proposed for, like, again, the raw material that we build all of
Yeah.
our work out of comes out of our heads. And it maybe makes sense to treat that in the same way that, performance athletes have known to treat, keeping a diary of how well you're doing.
Yeah.
I think it was Alec Honnold, who was a free soloist, first person to free solo El Capitan, um, once said that you have to keep a diary because you're trying as hard as you can all the time, and it always feels the same. And so if you don't keep track of the progress that you're making somewhere else, the felt experience never changes,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
and the idea that that not only applies to like high performance stuff, but to stuff like anxiety is stuff like, managing your anxiety is really interesting because I
Yeah.
bet you see that come out in the code too. Like I bet you can watch people's not just productivity, but like the quality, the clarity of how people can express themselves in their work. I bet that changes as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, all of this stuff is it's these psychological principles taken from clinical and intervention science that have been very successfully applied to things like sports psychology and sports performance. And like, as you say, why not to programming, right?
So digging into the idea of like managing healthy code review, like that is the thing that you stop there. One of the things that like this, I think, from my perspective, is really where the rubber meets the road, because this is where you take that improved self-awareness, that improved ability to sort of manage your own cognitive state and turn that into something that you bring to your relationship with your work and with your colleagues. Can you tell us a little bit more about like let's say we've climbed, we're almost at the top of the mountain here. What does it look like to put this into practice?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things, and I want to make it clear that when I talk about actively engaging, I know that there's a lot of opinions on how to write the perfect code review or, code review processes. This isn't that. This is how to write a code review that makes you actively and emotionally engage with the person that you're working with, right? Um, you can think about this as a method to cue to the other person that there is another person who is on the other end of the spectrum, that you recognize that you are two people working together, and you're kind of letting the other person know this is how exactly I need support, and this is how exactly I don't need support, for example. So for example, I'm saying the word example a lot, sorry. But for example,
It's good
one
to have
of the
examples. Examples are
yeah,
great.
examples
Like,
are really important, okay? So one of the things that we have people do is actually express how they feel about the code. Oftentimes you'll see folks say things like, here's my code, somebody review it. And the other person's like, great. Do you need, like, do you feel good about it? Do you feel bad about it? And when you don't know how somebody feels about their code, you're kind of cued to either give them very little feedback because you're like, I don't even know where to start. Or you're cued to give them too much feedback, and that too much feedback can be really nitpicky, because you're like, I don't know what this person wants, so I'm just gonna like go ham, right? It also cues for like a pretty like short abbreviated kind of tone. So you're not going to say things like, hey, I thought this was really good, and like, I wonder if you could do this other thing instead. You're going to say like, change this, right? So if you have anxiety and you get a code review back that says like, change this, that actually makes you feel worse because you're like, oh God, like, does this person hate me? Does this person like not like the thing I did? Instead, if you say something like, hey, I actually am feeling not great about this piece, like, would you mind looking at it? You're telling the other person, I don't feel good, like take that into consideration, like be gentle with me, right? And that actually cues you and sets you up for like a much nicer code review, actually, which is kind of cool.
that is genuinely fascinating because all of the best developers, like the most experienced developers and creators that I know, never seem to talk about software in terms of the guts and details of it. They talk about their impression of the elegance of it. They talk about how they feel about this corner of the code, how they feel about that. They have this sort of higher level understanding of the aesthetics of the code, like the way the code, I guess, feels or smells, or we talk about code smells as a turn of phrase, but there's
Yeah,
something real there. Like there is something that I am detecting that I find unpleasant or really wonderful, or and but we never bring conversations like that into, number one, particularly the code review process, but I think especially the practice of reviewing code with younger engineers. Like we don't open the idea, or at least I've never seen a
yeah,
place that talks about like, I'm uncertain about this. I don't feel great about how this thing works. I feel like it could be better there, right? And to
yeah,
use that as a sort of like, to be able to start a kind of a conversation in the way you would talk about art or the way people talk about music. This evokes a certain feeling,
yeah.
right? And being able to talk about how this evokes a certain feeling lets musicians identify things that help them make better music.
Mhm.
Like maybe we can have that.
Yeah, I think what's really cool too is like, I mean, it can be really scary to be the first person to do this on your team, but sometimes like being the first person to say, I feel this way about my code can trigger everybody else on the team to do the same. I actually had a former participant reach out to me to let me know that they had been doing this, like letting people know how they feel about their code. And so several of their teammates reached out and were like, hey, like, I also don't feel good about my code sometimes. Like, thanks for saying that. And then it's like kind of become a team-wide thing where people start saying things like, I don't feel good about the way I did this, but I do feel good about the way I did XYZ, right? So it's become like, even just like doing it yourself has become like a nice model for other folks on the team to pick up, which is pretty cool.
I think the idea of having conversations that are, you know, where correctness is somewhere you're getting to rather than something that is sheet of glass that you've got to somehow see past and can't touch or anything is actually fascinating. Like, because what you're talking about is very much like what you're talking about is people's connection to their labor, right? People's how they feel about their work, and their ability to take pride in their work, to feel good about it, and to have that sense of pride somehow improved and increased by the practice of code review. Like
Yeah.
the idea of we talk about code review in terms of evaluating code correctness, but this idea that code review can be like a place where we can build something we are more proud of together. Uh, I'm, it
Yeah.
feels like a tragic gap in the field that we don't already have this.
Yeah, I mean, there's actually been some really cool research done by other folks, Alberto Baccelli being one, Christian Bird, among others, who have seen things like, code reviews aren't just about code quality and code base security. Yes, those things occur because of code reviews, but also you see things like increased trust between teammates. You see things like better collaboration. You see things like learning transfer, right? You see all these like really beautiful team processes that occur within a code review, which is pretty cool.
And I think the magic of it is that you also like you don't sacrifice quality to get here. Like this
Yeah,
isn't you're not making a trade-off, right? You are
exactly.
actually you are improving things overall by caring about the experience. I guess caring about the experience of caring.
Yeah, 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 absolutely.
So one of the things I wanted to mention, like you gathered a ton of evidence. You talked for a while about how hard it was to get here, right? And in particular, what running this intervention meant in terms of effort, and in terms of quality. Like, can you tell us a bit about like a little bit about getting here? Like what was the shape of this and what made it so difficult for you to build something, I guess, that you were confident that you felt good about, being a real thing that had real sort of empirical validity. Pardon me,
Yeah.
I stuttered over that. That has real empirical validity
Mhm.
over over the subject domain that we're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to note that like when you do an intervention study, it's not like the intervention's already made, right? You actually have to make the intervention yourself. You have to test that intervention, like pilot test that intervention, make sure it's landing, make sure it makes sense. So this actually took months of like actually creating the intervention, figuring out how I'm going to talk about things to software developers, testing it with coworkers and kind of software developer friends, things like that. So that took a big chunk of time. The other piece of it is, the methods design itself. When you run a randomized controlled trial, you want to control for as many things as possible. Obviously, you can't control for everything in the world because the world is messy, right? That's just like a fact of life. But it does mean that you want to make sure that there's roughly the same amount of people in each condition, which, when you're randomly assigning people to the workshop condition versus the control condition, it matters. You also want to make sure about like little things like making sure that time zones are split equally between conditions. So for example, and this is kind of like a small thing, but it's an important thing in terms of facilitation. When I'm facilitating at night, I know I don't feel as good. I'm very much a morning person. I'm not very much a night person. So there is the small chance that workshops that were done at night weren't as good as the ones done in the morning. There is that chance, right? So you want to
Mhm.
make sure that the night workshops are split between workshop and control condition, right? That way there's no chance that like, the workshop only worked because those were all in the morning and that's when Carol is on, right? And night is when Carol hates herself. So like you want to make sure that that is split nicely.
Are we? Should we have an intervention here?
No,
Is this
I'm just like
an evening
so
person
sleepy
thing?
at night.
That's right.
You want to make sure that there's like many different kind of time zones represented. Of course, not possible to do every single time zone. But kind of doing your best. This also means an intense amount of coordination. So reminding participants to take the surveys, reminding participants to take the assessment measures, reminding participants that there is a workshop coming up, reminding participants to take the post-workshop thing, there's a lot of just emailing that happens, quite frankly.
People,
Um, Yes, people, right.
Yeah.
And so, when you're like running the workshop and then you like pull up your giant spreadsheet and you're like, hey, I've emailed this person, great, great, great. So it's a lot of just kind of managing in that way, quite frankly. There is obviously like the just feeling tired. Being on all day is exhausting. We all know this. Workshops often went a little bit longer than planned, not because the content took longer than planned, but oftentimes folks wanted to stay a little bit later just to talk. I think this is just like a really beautiful comment on the work itself, though, where several times and different people would say things like, I wanted to stay on because like I just felt really seen and I just didn't want to leave. And I think that's just a really cool thing to like give an intervention that people are like, this was cool. I don't really want to leave. And I'm like, well, we got to close the Zoom room sometime, you know?
Well, I mean, when you've given somebody something that positive in an environment that is that supportive, I can
Mhm.
certainly imagine, and like different times at different contexts in my life, I've been that person in that room where it's like this feeling is so new
Mhm.
that I just want this conversation to keep going, right?
Yeah.
I just, um, and to some extent, especially when we're talking about anxiety, right? There is that fear of closing the window. There's that fear that if I step out of this room, that I won't have this anymore, that I won't have this again.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
that I think that that might be sort of the most beautiful part of this entire exercise is the fact that you can indeed not only take this with you to wherever you're going, but to be able to grant this experience to other people,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely.
And I think I have one more question. You've shared it with us a couple of anecdotes about this, and a couple of responses that you've got from participants here. What are your favorites? Like, what was your one or two favorite responses that you got from this?
Oh man. Something that I think one of the most like meaningful things that I got to see during a workshop that I like actually made me cry a little bit afterward was I just love people so much was when you know people will see someone who looks older or looks more experienced and feel like they can't talk about their anxiety. I had a workshop where someone who was older and had more experience, like came out right off the bat and was like, oh man, that anxiety is strong. And everyone was just like, you could see this like moment where people were like, oh, you also feel the anxiety. Like, that's really cool. Some of the participants actually worked with this person and they were like, I didn't know that you have anxiety, you principal engineer. That's wild. I guess it's not just me. And they said it was really powerful and kind of like made them feel like, wow, like even the really cool and superstar engineers on my team experience this anxiety. Like it must be okay for me to feel this, right? I think that was really cool. I had somebody reach out who let me know that they like downloaded the paper when it first came out and like highlighted it and like underlined things that were like me and like wrote things like that in the margin. And I thought that was just really cool where they were like, it's, they were saying like, it's really cool to see, so let me back up. It's a different thing to say that I feel anxiety and other people feel this anxiety. It's a really cool thing to say, I feel like this kind of anxiety, and there is a science report on this anxiety. Like it's so real that it's in science. And I think that is like a really cool validating piece where it's like, no, like it's actually science. This is real, right? Like that's another level of this is real. And they really felt that. And I thought that was really wonderful. And it also made me very, very happy. Yeah.
You mentioned right at the beginning of this conversation how lonely anxiety can feel, particularly when you're in a room full of other people who are also doing a fantastic job of covering up their own anxiety, right?
Yes.
And how that moment, like there's that moment of breaking the dam where it's like, no, let's talk about something like the product of our work is important, but we are concerned about it. Let's talk about our concerns. Let's talk about that as part of getting on this path to a place where we can be collectively proud,
Yeah.
of this work that we're doing together. Um, I'm really grateful to have been a part of this conversation. Carol, thank you very much for your time. And thank you again for this research.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. This research truly does come from my heart, like the very bottom of my heart, and it means the world to me that it's landed with so many people. So thank you. I appreciate that.
It does not take a lot to see that it's mattered a lot to a lot of people, and I think it will continue to do so.